Jean de Carrouges IV was a 14th-century French knight who governed estates in Normandy as a vassal of Count Pierre de Lancon and served under Admiral Jean de Vienne in several campaigns against the English and the forces of the Ottoman Empire. He became infamous in medieval France for fighting in the last judicial duel permitted by the French king and the Parlement of Paris. The combat was decreed in 1386 to contest charges of rape Carrouges had brought against his neighbour and erstwhile friend Jacques Le Gris on behalf of his wife Marguerite. It was attended by much of the highest French nobility of the time, led by King Charles VI and his family, including a number of royal dukes. It was also attended by thousands of ordinary Parisians, and in the ensuing decades was chronicled by such notable medieval historians as Jean Froissart, Jean Juvenal des Ursins and Jehan de Warren, described in the chronicles as a rash and temperamental man. Carrouges was also a fierce and brave warrior whose death in battle came after a 40-year military career in which he served in Normandy, Scotland and Hungary with distinction and success. He was also heavily involved in court politics, initially at the seat of his overlord Count Pierre of Alençon at Argentine, but later in the politics of the royal household at Paris, to which he was attached as a chevalier d'honneur and royal bodyguard in the years following the judicial duel. During his life he conducted a long trail of legal and financial dealings which infuriated his contemporaries and may have invited violence against himself and his family. The truth of the events which led him into public mortal combat in the Paris suburbs may never be known, but the legend is still debated and discussed 600 years later. Early life. Carrouges was born in the late 1330s in the village of St. Marguerite de Carrouges as the eldest son of knight and minor noble Jean de Carrouges III and his wife Nicole de Bouchard. Carrouges III was an influential man in Lower Normandy, being a vassal of the Count of Pierre and a veteran soldier in his service. Carrouges III had been rewarded for his long military service in the 100 Years' War with a knighthood and the title of Viscount of Bellême, a rank that came with command of a vital hill castle overlooking the town as well as the role of sheriff in the vicinity, a post carrying significant financial and social rewards. Carrouges IV grew up within his father's domain, centered around the village of Carrouges where the family maintained their own hereditary castle. He followed his father into the armed service of the Counts of Pierre and served in several minor campaigns against the English and routiers in Normandy. Following his majority at age 21, he was given a parcel of the family lands to administer and became interested in solidifying and expanding the family holdings. In 1367 the family castle and the village of Carrouges were destroyed by English soldiers and a new castle was built on a hilltop nearby, under instructions from Charles V of France. In the early 1370s, Carrouges IV married Jean de Tilly, a daughter of the Lord of Chambois whose dowry included lands and rents vital to Carrouges' ambition of expanding his family estates. Shortly after the wedding, Jean gave birth to a son, whose godfather was a neighbour and close friend of de Carrouges, Squire Jacques Le Gris. In 1377, Pierre de Lancon inherited his brother Robert's county of Perche with the castle of Bellême. In addition, he gained the fealty of his brother's vassals, including the Carrouges father and son as well as Jacques Le Gris. The younger Carrouges and Le Gris soon joined the court circle of the Count, centered around the town of Argentine. It was at Argentine that the friendship between Carrouges and Le Gris began to deteriorate, as Le Gris rapidly became a favorite of Count Pierre. While Carrouges was overlooked, Le Gris was rewarded for service to the Count, inheriting his father's lordship of the castle at Exmies and being granted a newly purchased estate at Arnoux-le-Forçon. Carrouges became jealous of his friend and the two men soon became rivals at the court. A year after entering Count Pierre's service, tragedy struck Carrouges as both his wife and son died of unknown but natural causes. In response, Carrouges left home and joined the service of Jean de Vienne accompanied by a retinue of 9 squires. With this force, under the overall command of King Charles V, Carrouges distinguished himself in minor actions against the English in Bersville, Carentan and Coutances in a 5-month campaign, during which over half his retinue were killed in battle or by disease. Marguerite.It, returning home in 1380 after a successful campaign, Carrouges married Marguerite.It, only daughter of the highly controversial Robert.It. Thibouville was a Norman lord who had twice sided against the French king in territorial conflicts, betrayals he was lucky to survive, albeit in reduced circumstances, by the union of Marguerite and Carrouges. Thibouville hoped to restore his family's status and wealth while Carrouges was hoping for an heir from the young Marguerite, whom contemporaries described as young, beautiful, good, sensible and modest. Shortly after his marriage, Carrouges revealed another motive for the union. The valuable estate of Arnoux-le-Forçon, given to his rival Jacques Le Gris 2 years earlier, had been formerly owned by Carrouges' father-in-law and had been bought by Count Pierre for 8,000 French livres in 1377. Carrouges immediately began a lawsuit to recover the land based on an assumed prior claim to it. The case dragged on for some months until ultimately Count Pierre was forced to visit his cousin King Charles VI to officially confirm his ownership of the land and his right to give it to whomever of his followers he chose. Despite losing the case, the lawsuit reflected very poorly on Carrouges at the court in Argentan and resulted in his further estrangement from Count Pierre's circle. 2 years after the Arnoux-le-Forçon lawsuit, Carrouges was once again in court facing Count Pierre, this time in dispute over the lands administered by his recently deceased father. Carrouges' death early in 1382 vacated the captaincy of the castle of Bellême, a post Carrouges IV believed would be his by right. However, due to the failed lawsuit 2 years earlier, Count Pierre passed Carrouges over for the captaincy and gave it to another of his followers. The infuriated Carrouges again brought legal action against his overlord and again he was defeated in court. The only lasting result of the action was the further separation of Carrouges and Count Pierre's court. In March 1383, Carrouges made a third effort to expand his family holdings, with the purchase of the neighboring fiefs of Quangny and Plainville from his neighbour Sir Jean de Vienne. The sale required approval from Count Pierre, who was overlord of both fiefs. But as consequence of the previous legal difficulties Carrouges had caused him, Pierre refused to permit the sale and insisted that Carrouges turn the properties over to him in exchange for a full refund of the original price paid. Carrouges had no choice but to comply and subsequently blamed Jacques Le Gris' influence for this new misfortune. Campaigning in Scotland. Late in 1384 Carrouges entered society for the first time since his marriage 4 years earlier, attending a party to celebrate the birth of a neighbour's son. Carrouges and Le Gris met at the celebration and agreed to end the quarrel, Carrouges introducing Le Gris to his wife Marguerite for the first time. A few months after this meeting, in March 1385, Carrouges attempted to increase his family wealth through military means, by joining the army of Jean de Vienne for an expedition sailing to Edinburgh. This force of about 3,000 soldiers was intended to unite with the Scottish army and raid northern England, distracting English forces from operations in France. Travelling with men-at-arms, horses, gold and equipment, Carrouges and his entourage rode to Sturys and took ship to Leith during the spring of 1385. On arrival in Scotland, much time was spent gathering Scottish troops together for the campaign on England, and the French were delayed for some months collecting supplies. The army thus did not move south until July, ravaging villages and farms in the region of the River Tweed before besieging Wark Castle and burning it to the ground. The Allied army then continued south through Northumberland and the burnt villages, towns, farms and castles across the line of advance in a large chevauchée. The English responded with an army led by King Richard II, which advanced against the Allied force and offered battle. The French prepared to fight, but the Scots allies retreated, leaving the French exposed, and they were consequently forced to retreat as well. Outside Edinburgh, the Scottish army dispersed, and the inhabitants of the city fled north, leaving the French alone in the city. Realizing that his force was outnumbered and without food or help, Vienne took the army south, rounding the English on the night of the 10th of August and re-entering Northumberland for further looting, attacking Carlisle but being unable to break through its walls. As the Franco-Scottish army returned northwards, it was attacked by an army under Henry Percy, which destroyed the army's wagon train and took many prisoners. When the defeated French returned to Edinburgh, the Scots refused to provision the French army, and many men died of disease or starvation. Late in the year, the French army boarded ship and returned to Flanders, bankrupt and defeated. Despite the expedition's failure, Carrouges had distinguished himself in the campaign. Although he had lost 5 of his 9 men-at-arms and a substantial amount of money, he had also been awarded a knighthood on the battlefield, substantially raising his social status and the amount of money he received from military service. Despite being in poor health on his return from Scotland, Carrouges had business in Paris, and in January 1386 he travelled there to collect his wages for the previous year's campaign, leaving his wife with her mother-in-law at the village of Capeau-Misnil. Rape of Marguerite. Before setting off for Paris, Carrouges first visited Argenton to meet with Count Pierre, and there announcing his intention of continuing to the capital. What followed was a sequence of events which will forever remain unclear, but which would have a dramatic effect on the lives of all concerned. What is certain is that Carrouges encountered his rival Jacques Le Gris at the court of Count Pierre, and words were exchanged, although what was said is unknown. In contrast to his bankrupt rival, Le Gris had not been on the Scottish expedition and had grown wealthier in Carrouges' absence. Le Gris also had a reputation as a fierce and strong soldier, in addition to that of a notorious womanizer, a reputation that may have played a part in the allegations which followed. On the morning of the 18th of January 1386, Dame Nicole de Carrouges departed her chateau at Capeau-Misnil for the neighbouring town of Saint-Pierre-sur-Dives, where she had legal business to attend to. Although the journey was only a short one, she apparently took some or all of the household servants with her, leaving her daughter-in-law unattended during the day. Marguerite's testimony then alleged that a man-at-arms named Adam Louvel knocked on the chateau door, which Marguerite opened herself in the absence of servants. According to Marguerite, Louvel then made inquiries about a loan he owed Jean de Carrouges before suddenly announcing that Jacques Le Gris was outside the door and insisted on seeing her. At her refusal, Louvel exclaimed that, "He loves you passionately, he will do anything for you and he greatly desires to see you." Although Marguerite protested, Le Gris then forced his way into the house and propositioned her, offering money if she would remain silent of their affair. When Marguerite refused, Le Gris then violently raped her with the aid of Louvel and threatened her not to tell anyone what had occurred on pain of death. Marguerite remained silent of her ordeal for several days, until her husband's return on the 22nd of January. Upon hearing of the encounter, the outraged Carrouges summoned his circle of courtiers and friends, including his mother and most of Marguerite's family, and a council was convened where Marguerite repeated her account of the rape. Carrouges decided immediately to begin legal proceedings against Le Gris, but faced great difficulties in prosecuting them as Le Gris was a favorite of Count Pierre, who would act as judge in the case. In addition, the case was weak because the only witness was Marguerite. Indeed, the trial at Argentan was so one-sided an affair that Carrouges and his wife did not even bother to attend. Pierre acquitted Le Gris of all charges, and furthermore accused Marguerite of inventing or even dreaming the attack. Legal proceedings in search of a fair trial. Carrouges traveled to Paris to appeal to the king himself, knowing that his case depended solely on his wife's testimony and was therefore weak. Carrouges developed a plan. Instead of proceeding with a normal criminal trial, Carrouges would challenge Le Gris to a judicial duel, the survivor of which would thus have been deemed by God to have been the rightful claimant. Such trials by combat, once common in France, were rare by 1386 and the chance of one being permitted by the king unlikely. Nevertheless, Carrouges saw this scheme as his best option of procuring justice and redeeming his wife's reputation. A few days after his arrival in Paris, Carrouges was presented to the king at the Château de Vincennes in order to make the first official appeal in the lengthy trial process. In doing so, he captured the imagination of the French court, which later becomes so fascinated with the Carrouges-Le Gris trial that it would shape its schedule around watching the culminating combat. On the 9th of July 1386, the second stage in the legal process began when both Carrouges and Le Gris, with the followers, presented themselves before the Parlement of Paris at the Palais de Justice to issue the formal challenge. This involved reciting their accusations and throwing down a gauntlet signifying their intention to fight. The declarations were pronounced in front of the king, his brother Louis of Valois, and the entire Parliament, who decided to initially hear the case as an ordinary criminal one and defer the decision on whether to permit the judicial duel until both sides had given testimony. Attempts had been made to persuade Le Gris to insist on a church trial, but these proved unsuccessful as Le Gris wished to counter the accusation with a lawsuit against his opponent claiming 40,000 livres for defamation. Following the declarations, a number of high-ranking noblemen stepped forward to act as seconds in the duel for both men, including Walleran of St. Paul for Carrouges and Philip of Artois, Count of Eu for Le Gris. The criminal trial continued for most of the summer and Carrouges, Le Gris and Marguerite were all called on to give evidence. Marguerite was by this time visibly pregnant, although medieval medical knowledge claimed that children could not be conceived as a result of rape, and her condition therefore was determined to have no bearing on the case. Adam Louvel and at least one of Marguerite's maidservants also gave evidence, and, as was the custom of the day for people of low birth, they were tortured to test the veracity of the testimony. During this process neither produced evidence incriminating Le Gris, although Louvel rival was subsequently challenged to a duel himself by Marguerite's cousin, Ottoman Dubois. In his evidence, Carrouges' statement primarily repeated and supported his wife's testimony, while Le Gris accused Carrouges of inventing the charges and beating his wife into making the accusations against the squire. In his statement, Le Gris painted a picture of a man driven wild with anger and jealousy who sought to restore his family fortune by concocting false accusations against his most significant rival. Le Gris also offered alibis for his whereabouts during the entire week the crime was supposed to have been committed, and attempted to explain that it was not possible for him to have ridden the 25 miles which supposedly separated him from Marguerite on the morning in question. A rebuttal from Carrouges emphasized the shame the trial had brought to his family as a reason against its invention, and offered a counter-demonstration of horsemanship, indicating that the suggested 50-mile round trip was not impossible even if Le Gris's alibi was true. Le Gris's alibi was compromised some days later when the man providing it, a squire named Jean de Carrouges, was arrested for committing rape in Paris even as the trial progressed. On the 15th of September, with the king in Flanders preparing for an invasion of England, the Parliament handed down its verdict. As they had been unable to determine the guilt in the case, the two men would fight a duel to the death on the 27th of November 1386. Trial by combat. The 2 months following the verdict were ones of great activity between the two parties and the citizens of Paris. As judicial duels were now so rare, no established battleground had been set aside, and a jousting arena at the Abbey of St. Martin-des-Champs north of the city agreed to host the combat. Both Carrouges and Le Gris endured bouts of illness in the weeks following the verdict, but recovered with the aid of the families and supporters, who had joined the hundreds of people flocking to the city from nearby regions to witness the fight. Indeed, the event was so popular that when King Charles VI believed that his return to Paris in time for the combat would be held up in Flanders due to bad roads, he sent a fast messenger to Paris delaying the duel by a month in order that he would be present to witness it. This royal intervention set the date for the combat back to the 29th of December 1386. In the months between trial and duel, Marguerite and the French Queen Isabeau of Bavaria had both given birth to sons. While Marguerite's son Robert was a strong, healthy boy, the Dauphin was a sickly child, and on the 28th of December he died. Rather than descend into mourning, the king ordered a frenzy of parties and celebrations, the pinnacle of which was intended to be the duel between Carrouges and Le Gris. The morning of the combat saw thousands of Parisians arriving at the Abbey at dawn, long before the appointed hour. Amongst the spectators were the king and his entourage, including his uncles John, Duke of Berry, Philip the Bold and Louis II, Duke of Bourbon, as well as his brother the Duke of Orleans. Also present, dressed in black and sitting in a carriage overlooking the field, was Marguerite. Should her husband lose the battle, she would be burnt at the stake in Montfaucon immediately following the duel, having been thus proven guilty of perjury by its outcome. The combatants took the field in the early afternoon, mounted and dressed in plate armor. Both carried a lance, long sword, a heavy battle axe known as the Holy Trinity, and a long dagger called the Misericordia. Carrouges appeared first, reciting his charges against Le Gris to the king and crowd before Le Gris followed and did the same. Le Gris was then knighted in order that he and Carrouges be of equal standing during the fight. Both knights then dismounted and gave oaths to God, the Virgin Mary and St. George, thereby sanctifying God's judgment over the duel's outcome. Finally, Carrouges approached his wife and pledged his honor before her, kissing her and promising to return. As the field was cleared, Silence descended on the arena following the king's instructions that anybody who interfered in the duel would be executed, and that anyone who shouted or verbally interrupted the combat would lose a hand. Readying the steeds, the knights squared up, and at the marshal's signal, charged towards one another. The lances struck but failed to penetrate the thick hides covering the shields, and the combatants wheeled and charged again, this time striking one another on the helms. Rounding once more, the knights charged a third time, again striking shields, and this time both shattering the lances. Reeling from the impact, the warriors drew their axes and charged a fourth time, slashing and kicking at one another in the center of the field. They traded blows until Le Gris, the much stronger man, was able to drive his axe through the neck of Carrouges' horse. As the beheaded beast tumbled to the ground, Carrouges jumped clear and lashed out with his own weapon, disemboweling Le Gris' steed in turn. Now on foot, the knights drew swords and returned to battle, Le Gris again proving stronger than his opponent and slowly gaining the upper hand. After several minutes of engagement, Carrouges slipped and Le Gris was able to stab his rival through the right thigh. As the crowd gasped and murmured, Le Gris stepped back to view his opponent's injury, and Carrouges desperately counter-attacked, wrestling Le Gris to the ground. Le Gris' heavy armor prevented him from regaining his feet, and Carrouges repeatedly stabbed at his flawed opponent, his blows denting but not puncturing the thick plate steel. Realizing that his sword was inadequate, Carrouges straddled Le Gris and used the handle of his dagger to smash the lock, holding Le Gris' faceplate in position. Even as his opponent struggled beneath him, Carrouges tore the plate off and demanded that Le Gris admit his guilt. Le Gris refused and cried out, "In the name of God and on the peril and damnation of my soul, I am innocent." Infuriated, Carrouges drove his dagger through Le Gris' neck, killing him instantly. Standing over his vanquished opponent, Carrouges remained on the field as the crowd cheered him and pages rushed to bind his wound. He then kneeled before the king, who presented him with a prize of 1,000 francs in addition to a royal income of 200 francs a year. Only then did he greet his wife in an emotional scene before the thousands of spectators. Jean and Marguerite de Carrouges then, with the crowd following in a great procession, rode from the abbey to the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris, to give thanks for the victory. A few weeks after the duel, Parliament awarded Carrouges a further 6,000 livres in gold and a position within the royal household. Such rewards enabled Carrouges to begin further legal action, attempting to exert his earlier claim to Arnoux-la-Forson. However, this land which Carrouges coveted remained beyond his reach. Count Pierre, who held the land, never forgave Carrouges the death of his favorite, and held the estates from him in court.